The wilderness, so beautiful, yet dangerous at the same time. We as the human race tend to destroy nature wherever we can, however we can, and sometimes it strikes back. The Dyatlov Pass Incident is no exception. Welcome to the Rabbithole. In 1959, a group of 10 hikers consisting of university students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute in Russia, Yuri Doroshenko, Lyudmila Dubanina, Alexander Kolevatov, Zenaida Kolmogorova, Yuri Krivonashenko, Rustem Slobodin, Nikolai Tobyx-Brignol, Semyon Zolotorov, Yuri Yudin, and the leader, Igor Dyatlov, were set out to try and climb a difficult mountain known as Gora Otorten, and to reach the peak, landing them the pristine title of first in the world to do so. What an ambitious and commendable goal to have. So, to start this journey, they arrived by train at a town called ELFL on 25th of January. From there they took a ride to Spacial, the only inhabited village to the north. On the 27th of January, they traveled towards the Gora Otorten mountain. January 28th, Yuri Yudin, who had a few health ailments plaguing him before this expedition started, couldn't journey any further due to knee and joint pain, and he had to go home. From this point onwards, the group turned into a 9-hiker group instead of 10 as it was intended to be. On January 31st, they reached a highland area to prepare for the climb. In a wooded valley, they decided on stashing some extra food and equipment to be used when they are done with the hike and they head back to civilization. The very next day, they started moving through a pass. This is where the story got its name, Dyatlov Pass. They were planning to move over the pass to make camp for the night on the opposite side, but due to weather conditions worsening in the area, they lost direction and deviated west, ending up towards the top of Kolad Saikal. They realized their mistake, and instead of moving 1.5 kilometers downhill to a forested area for some shelter, they ended up making camp there and then. This was probably due to Dyatlov not wanting to lose elevation, leading him to make the choice to camp there. Now, Dyatlov was supposed to send a telegram to a sports club they belonged to as soon as they returned back to Spacial when the expedition was over. It was expected to take the group of hikers about 16 or so days to complete the trek, ending around the 12th of February. Before Yuri Yudin left the group due to his joint pain, Dyatlov told him that he expected the trip to take longer than 16 days, possibly making the trip surpass the 12th of February due date. When the 12th arrived, nobody suspected anything bad happened, since Dyatlov told them that the trip would most likely take longer. On the 20th of February, people started to worry, namely the families of the hikers, and they insisted on a rescue operation be conducted immediately. A rescue group consisting of volunteer students and teachers was set out to search for the hikers. Eventually, even police, helicopters and planes were sent out to look for the hikers. On the 26th of February, the searchers found the group's tent. The tent wasn't like you would imagine it. It was covered in snow, almost like somebody threw snow on top of it. Now, here's where things start to get strange real quick. The hikers were missing, and all their belongings and shoes were left behind. To make it even weirder, the tent was cut open from the inside. There were 9 sets of footprints belonging to the 9 hikers, and the footprints indicate that some had only socks on, some had only one shoe on, and some were barefoot. What on earth? These footprints allowed investigators to follow it all the way down the edge of a nearby woods on the opposite side of the pass. Eventually, the footprints were covered up by snow, ending the trail at a small fire. There, they found the first 2 bodies, Krivonoshenko and Doroshenko. They were found wearing only their underwear, no shoes, no warm clothing. It seems one of them tried to climb the tree to look for the camp spot due to some of the branches on the tree being broken. It is very possible that whoever climbed the tree must have reached a certain point into the tree and slipped, or the branches were too brittle to hold the weight and they fell. Between some trees and the camp, 3 more bodies were found: Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin. The positions they were found in suggested that they were trying to return to their camp area, back to their tent. They were found round about 300 meters from the tree where Krivonoshenko and Doroshenko were found. 5 of the hikers were found, all lifeless, but there were 9, remember? The remaining 4 took a little over 2 months to find: Dubinina, Kolovatov, Brignoles, and Zolotorov. Where were they found? Well, on the 4th of May, they were found buried in 13 feet of snow in a ravine, 246 feet away from the broken tree branches further into the woods. 3 of the 4 were better dressed than others, and from the looks of it, the clothing worn by them came from others who passed before them, and they took the clothing and wore it in the hopes of surviving the cold. One of the hikers found in the snow was Dubinina, and she was wearing the burnt and torn trousers of Krivonoshenko, with her left foot and shin wrapped in a torn jacket, possibly insinuating that she fractured a leg or hurt it somehow. And this was her attempt at trying to add support to the hurt leg? Perhaps. Medical examination was conducted after the first 5 hikers were found, and no injuries were found to have been the cause of them perishing. Due to this, it was concluded that they all passed due to hypothermia. Slobodin had a small crack in his skull, but this was likely not fatal. Now, the 4 bodies found on the 4th of May shifted the whole narrative of this story onto its head. Fabius Brignol had major skull damage. Dubinina and Zolotorov had major chest fractures. It's said that the force needed to cause all of this damage would have to be extremely high, and it would be similar to that of a car crash. Even more strange, the bodies had no external wounds like you would have with bone fractures or bones sticking out due to breakage, and it's as if they were subjected to high levels of pressure. If you think this was strange, wait till you hear this. All 4 of the bodies had soft tissue damage. Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, part of her lips, facial tissue, and a piece of her skull bone. Zolotorov had both his eyes missing, and Kolovatov had his eyebrows missing. This is just plain strange. Why their eyebrows? Now, the body examiner said that these injuries were caused due to the location they were found in, meaning possibly scavenger animals eating them. And to me, this does make sense. It is very possible. So, according to the findings that investigators and medical examiners made, 6 of the hikers perished due to hypothermia, while the rest was from fatal injuries. They all seem to have passed about 7 hours after their last meal. From what was gathered around the camp, everyone left out of their own. Nobody seemed to have been forced by anyone. Traces of radiation were even found on one of the hikers' clothing. Their deaths were all chalked up due to a compelling natural force. What kind of force would be needed to cause all of this damage? That's a good question, which we will hopefully answer later on into the video. Due to diaries and cameras being found at the previous campsite, the search team was able to track down the accident site. After the investigation was ended due to finding no guilty party for the passing of the hikers, the diaries fell into public domain in 2009 and the cameras were kept in a private archive of one of the investigators. The film material was donated to the Dyatlov Foundation, and the foundation's aim was to continue the investigation of the case and to maintain the Dyatlov Museum to preserve the memory of the dead hikers. The case has laid dormant until the 12th of April 2018, when Zolotarov's remains were exhumed, and it was found that the injuries resembled that of someone who got hit by a car. The Russian authorities reopened the case in February 2019, and this time, only 3 possibilities were put forward for the deaths: an avalanche, a slab avalanche, or a hurricane. Now, before we discuss what on earth could have happened to these hikers, let's discuss some things picked up by people involved in this case. A 12-year-old boy named Yuri Kuntsevich was at 5 of the hikers' funerals, and he said he remembers their bodies having a deep brown tan. Interesting. A group of hikers that were about 50 kilometers south of the incident said they saw strange orange spheres in the sky to the north on that night. Areas all around the spot were seen having the spheres during the period from February to March. And this was during the hike period and even after it. Strange lights? That's bizarre. What could this be? Perhaps aliens? Now, before you think the reports were made by residents looking for clout or attention, some of the witnesses were from the meteorology service and the military. So yeah, it wasn't from some untrustworthy sources. These claims were made years later, and many kept silent for years, fearing they would be hurt or silenced by the higher-ups. One of these witnesses was a former police officer who led the first investigation back in '59. And he said that high-ranking regional officials told him to keep quiet about the lights, and they told him to dismiss the claims. My question is, why on earth would these officials tell him to keep quiet? To sweep it under the rug? I mean, maybe it was to prevent panic, but now they made themselves look bad, making it look like they can't be trusted. What else could they be lying about? See what I mean? Trying to lie and hide info inevitably backfires, making you look bad and untrustworthy. Anyways, let's discuss the possible causes now of the deaths. The government believes it can either be an avalanche, slab avalanche, or a hurricane. I will say, the way these people passed are very, very strange. A compelling natural force, to be exact. When you look at where and how the hikers were found, an avalanche theory would make sense. They tried to find shelter in the forest and they attempted to make a fire to stay warm. They probably heard an avalanche coming, and in the heat of the moment, in the dark, they split up into 3 groups by accident. One group ended up by the trees, one group ended up nearby the trees, the last group went furthest away into the trees. The group by the campfire tried to make a fire to stay warm, but failed. The group nearby them wanted to get back to the tent and ended up perishing due to the cold. The last group, that was furthest away deeper into the forest, passed due to being buried in snow, possibly falling into a snow hole? This theory has its own flaws, believe it or not, even though it makes a lot of sense. Firstly, the area doesn't look like there was an avalanche. The tent was perfectly in place and some skis were still in the ground, pointing upwards, although not all. The trees weren't damaged or tilting downhill, and there were no debris scattered around the area like that of an avalanche. Also, the bodies were found within a month, and yet they were only covered in a thin layer of snow. If there was an avalanche, they would have been buried in snow. That would have possibly made it hard, if not impossible, to find their bodies. Another thing to take note of is that many expeditions to the region has been made since the incident, and nobody ever reported conditions in which an avalanche could be created or formed. The study was done in the area with up-to-date terrain showcase technology, and it was concluded that the area was very unlikely to have had an avalanche happen. Also, Dyatlov and Zolotorov were highly experienced skiers, and they wouldn't have hiked and camped in an area that has the potential to have an avalanche. That would have been really reckless on their part. Now, when we look at the footprints that lead out of the tent, they weren't made by people who were running from something dangerous, running from an imminent threat. It was consistent with someone who would walk at a normal pace. Why would you walk at a normal pace when an avalanche was imminent? That makes no sense. A group of investigators reviewed the evidence of the 1959 case, and they confirmed that the weather for that night was harsh and windy. This was not taken into consideration with the first investigators back in 1959 when they got to the site of the accident. By the time the investigators reached the area, the weather improved and any remains of a snowstorm or possible avalanche had settled and was covered up by fresh new snow. But also, the fact that the tent poles and skis were perfectly intact, as well as the tent wasn't crushed, other than the snow that was being placed on it, makes the plausibility of an avalanche harder to believe. Also, remember that the tracks of the hikers were still visible, even after a supposed avalanche? Harsh weather most definitely played a role in what happened that night. And the reconstruction of what possibly could have happened that night, according to experts, was that the group arrived at Spacial mountain slope, and there they erected their 9-person tent, weakening the snow base due to them digging to place the tent. On the day of the accident, there was a heavy snowfall with strong winds. During the night, the snow above the tent uphill started to cave under the new snow that was being formed. This ended up pushing on the tent fabric, and the hikers left the tent in a panicked state. Some were able to put on bits of clothing while others didn't. The entrance was blocked, so they had to resort to cutting open the tent from the inside. Once outside, the group split up and 2 ended up at the tent, making a campfire for some heat. And they obviously passed due to hypothermia later on. 3 other hikers tried getting back to the tent for perhaps the sleeping bags, but failed due to wearing inadequate footwear. The last group had better clothing and footwear on due to them taking off the clothing off of the other hikers, and they tried going deeper into the forest to perhaps find a better shelter spot to survive the weather and the night. They failed as well, where their bodies were found 2 months later by the search and rescue team. Again, this whole avalanche one has its flaws. If the snow was pushing on the tent, how could some of the hikers have time to get dressed inside the tent? Wouldn't all of this have happened very quickly? They wouldn't have had adequate time to escape the tent. So what are some other theories floating around? Well, some speculate it might be a wolverine. I saw someone on Reddit posing the idea that this creature was the reason for the hikers panicking and leaving the tent. According to this theory, they were all sleeping in the tent when the animal came up to the tent and stood still at the entrance of the tent. Due to them not being able to escape out that intended way, they cut the tent open at the side and got out through there. Now, perhaps this could be possible, since the wolverine is a carnivore, meaning they eat meat, but they are said to be solitary animals. They don't like to interact with humans. If the animal was starving and it didn't eat for a long time, it might make rash decisions and attack people. I don't know if this is possible though, since there were no tracks found other than that of the hikers. Yet again, maybe the animal's tracks were covered up by new snow, but not those of the hikers, since they are heavier and would make deeper, bigger prints. Interesting theory, nonetheless. Someone else mentioned a theory, something that made me think deep, and it actually creeped me out a lot. Perhaps Dyatlov himself was the one who ended the lives of the hikers and then himself. To substantiate their claim, they said they read in the diaries of the hikers that some of the hikers wrote how Dyatlov was acting weird and even aggressive one time when one of the girls didn't take off her shoes as promptly as he wanted, and he threatened to kick her out of the tent. It seems Dyatlov had a history of anger and mental issues going at the time, and it's not hard to see someone with issues like that snapping and doing something rash. I didn't believe this claim at first, of course, so I went to read the diaries myself, and my goodness, it's true. Some of the hikers wrote in their diaries how Dyatlov was rude for a whole evening, and they couldn't even recognize him. It was like he was a whole different person. All of this can be found on dyatlovpass.com if you would like to read it yourself. If Dyatlov was indeed the one who ended the other hikers, how would he have done it? The only way I could see him do it would be with a gun. Going back and looking at the evidence found at the scene, the footprints of the hikers weren't sporadic like you would think of if there was an avalanche. It was normal paced. This would go perfectly with the gun theory, seeing how he would be ordering them out of the tent one by one, and if they ran or made any sudden movements, he would shoot them. However, this theory has its own flaws. Firstly, no gun was found at the scene, and nobody was found to have gunshot wounds anywhere on their bodies. Seeing how he obviously had some internal issues going on at the time and could easily do something rash, leading him to end his crew, the fact that no gun was found or any gunshot wounds on the hikers clearly rules out the possibility that Igor was the cause of their deaths. What about a Yeti attack or even government weapons? Well, trace amounts of radiation were found on some of the hikers, indicating that it might have been some sort of government weapon that were tested on them. Seeing how the government and higher ups tried to keep certain details of the case secret, like the mysterious lights that were seen in the area for an example. The damage the hikers sustained was stated to be equal to that of a car crash accident, which means whatever happened to them had to be powerful. I don't know of any type of weapon that would do such damage. Maybe a sonic weapon? And that's why they had internal injuries and no outside wounds? Maybe, maybe not. What if it could be a Yeti? This accident did happen in snowy mountains after all, the home of Yetis. Yetis are said to be giant ape-like creatures that are powerful enough to cause serious injuries to whoever might cross their path. So maybe it could have been a Yeti attack? Well, I don't think it could be, even though the damage they sustained could support that. Firstly, there were no footprints found of a giant ape-like creature, only that of the hikers. Something of that size would leave deeper footprints in the snow than that of the hikers. Their footprints were found, but no other prints. Now to me, the footprints not being there is the only thing not making the Yeti theory possible. But if there were signs around the area of something like that, then it would be more plausible. Now remember I mentioned radiation earlier? Some were found on the bodies, and this was ruled out to be nothing more than them using something called a stove wick. They were using a stove to prepare food on in their tent, so this was where the radiation came from. Someone also posed the idea that perhaps the hikers took some LSD, aka substances, and that's what caused them to make bad decisions by leaving the tent and splitting up and eventually passing from hypothermia. Substance usage can lead to hallucinations, confusion, and erratic behavior. I suppose it could fit the story somewhat, but then we have the glaring issue of the internal damage they sustained. So this can easily be ruled out. What about the indigenous people of the area attacking them? Maybe they had a hand in this accident? An indigenous people known as the Mansi people inhabit the areas where this accident happened, and it could be possible for them to have attacked the hikers for encroaching on their lands. Kalaitsakal means dead mountain in the local Mansi language. What a creepy name for a mountain, especially since people actually passed on its slopes. Maybe they could have attacked the hikers with clubs or weapons, leading to their massive internal and skull damage. Again, we have issues with this theory. No external wounds or bruises were found on the hikers, and no other footprints were found, other than that of the hikers. Then there is the issue of the massive damage the hikers sustained. That wouldn't be possible for your average man to inflict with their bare hands. With weapons, yeah, sure, but there were no bruises to indicate this. To bury this theory even deeper, several Mansi people were interrogated, but it was concluded that they were innocent and had nothing to do with it. So what theories are left now? Are there any? Well, yes. One that might be more plausible than the stuff we discussed so far. And it could possibly tie into the avalanche theory. It's called paradoxical undressing. Paradoxical undressing happens when someone is having extreme cases of hypothermia and the blood vessels become constricted due to the cold. The person ends up becoming confused, disorientated, and combative due to changes in blood flow. They may end up undressing because they feel like they are overheating. And this can be caused by muscles getting exhausted due to the cold, or caused by the blood vessels not working the way they should. Another condition, known as terminal burrowing, could be signs of a severe case of hypothermia. Warm-blooded animals who hibernate will dig and burrow a small den to hibernate for the winter, such as bears for an example. Similarly, the person tries in a last-ditch effort to preserve heat, and they dig a hole and crawl in, or try and hide behind or in containers. This seems to be what could have happened to some of the hikers who were found buried in snow. Now, why am I not seeing people mention the biggest red flag of all? Why on earth were they naked in the tent? Why? Why were some not wearing clothing to begin with, before it all went south? In my mind, when you are in cold weather like that, sleeping naked is the worst decision anybody can make. You should be sleeping in clothing to prevent hypothermia. Some might say, well, they were naked so they could sleep in a spoon position to generate and hold heat. But that still doesn't make sense to me. Don't you think it would be better for everyone to be dressed and sleep in a spoon position? That way, everyone is surrounded by clothing and heat. This is the thing that really bugs me about this case to begin with. Why they would sleep naked in such bad weather, seeing how we know now that the wind was blowing harshly. That seems like such a dumb thing to do in the first place when you look at the circumstances. What if they were sleeping naked cause their clothes were wet or soaked and they couldn't wear it? Well, there is still an issue there. Why did they have only one pair of clothing each then on the trip? When you go on an expedition like that, you should always make sure to have loads of clothing and supplies, so you don't have a scenario where you have to sleep naked due to lack of spare clothing. See how this whole thing just sounds and looks so ludicrous? I don't know. It might just be me not knowing how camping and hikes in cold weather works, but to me, this doesn't make sense at all, honestly. Let's go back to the avalanche one. I would subscribe to this if the tent was destroyed and everyone were buried in snow. As I mentioned earlier, the tent was perfectly intact with its poles in the ground, and even skis were standing upright in the snow. The trees in the area looked just fine. Nothing out of the ordinary there. Krivonishenko and Doroshenko were found by some trees, yet they weren't covered up by snow like they should have been in an avalanche. Whenever something like that happens, there's an aftermath. Now that I think about it, if there was an avalanche, they all would have been dead at the same time. Yet, from the evidence, it seems some died earlier than others, since some of the hikers were wearing the clothes of others, and one even had the clothing wrapped around the foot, Dubinina. So, if there was an avalanche, some of the hikers somehow survived, if only for a while, eventually succumbing to their internal injuries and hypothermia. Another theory could be that the accident was caused by a slab avalanche. This is different than your average avalanche. Due to them digging into the snow to place the tent, digging some sort of platform into the snow to protect themselves from the winds, they weakened the snow, leading to an avalanche. From the looks and sounds of it, this slab avalanche would be small and would only have happened at the tent, sweeping the tent away or engulfing the tent. Again, no matter how you look at it, an avalanche couldn't have been the culprit. There were no evidence to substantiate this. The tent wasn't swept away or buried in snow. The only snow that was found on the tent was most likely due to the hikers throwing snow onto the tent to prevent it from being blown away by the strong winds. We have one more theory, and to me, this is the only one that makes the most sense to me. Katabatic winds coupled with hypothermia and terminal burrowing and paradoxical undressing. Seeing how there are no solid evidence for an avalanche, but there is for winds, makes me side with this theory. In my mind, this is what happened that night. They were all sleeping when they were woken up by the strong winds outside the tent. They got scared and they tried to leave the tent through the exit, but perhaps they couldn't see where the zipper was due to not finding a torch in the tent quickly enough to light their way. Perhaps the tent was starting to break loose from the poles in the ground, and it started lifting a bit, spooking them even more, forcing them to make a quick exit by cutting the side open. They managed to find a flashlight before leaving, switching it on and putting it on the tent facing the woods. By doing this, they can see where the tent is by looking for the light. Some of the hikers left while others stayed behind to try and get dressed, and they eventually left the tent too. They stood outside for a bit to throw snow on the tent to prevent it from being damaged even more or blown away by the winds. From here, all the hikers ran and got to the woods nearby to rest there, and after crafting a plan to stick out the night outside of the tent, they decided on making makeshift shelters in the snow. Someone climbed the tree to look for the tent to see where it is, but fell and got injured. Perhaps this was Dubinina, seeing how she was the one who had the piece of clothing around her foot, insinuating some sort of injury. She and 3 other hikers tried to go deeper into the woods to build a makeshift shelter in the ground. They succeeded, but saw the others who tried building a fire didn't succeed due to the winds blowing, and they passed due to hypothermia. The clothing were taken off of them, and Dubinina and 3 more hikers got back to the shelters. But here, their shelters collapsed on top of them, trapping them, where they were found months later. The last 3 remaining survivors tried getting back to the tent, but failed. Now, this is what I think happened when I look back at all the evidence at face value. To me, this is the only thing that makes sense. An avalanche was not possible, seeing how the area showed no signs of something like that happening. Also, like I mentioned, data showed that at the time of the accident, an avalanche would have not been possible. There were no signs that an avalanche could happen. I really have no idea what theory to follow, since they all have their possibilities, yet at the same time, their flaws. In all honesty, the only thing making the most sense to me is the katabatic winds with the hypothermia, paradoxical undressing, and terminal burrowing. This whole mystery even spawned its own creepypasta / Reddit horror story on r/nosleep titled, "My grandfather knew what happened in the Dyatlov Pass Incident. I translated his diary." There was even a movie made inspired by this incident called Devil's Pass. The movie is about 5 American students who venture out to the spot where the Dyatlov Pass incident took place to uncover what happened. If you are interested in the horror story from Reddit or the movie, I highly recommend you check them out. Quick disclaimer: all the info mentioned in this video came from a Wikipedia article on the accident, as well as from Reddit where people discuss the topic in detail. All theories have their own strong points and flaws, and we will never truly 100% know what happened that day, since we weren't there. All we have to go off of is by using the info left behind by the hikers in their diaries and on their cameras, and the scene of the accident. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you liked what you saw, comment down below your thoughts and opinions, and subscribe to soothe that fascination.